Our last witness, Lieutenant Sheehan.
Lieutenant, do you solemnly swear or solemnly or sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, or upon perjury, penalty of perjury?
Yes.
Lieutenant Sheehan, how long have you been a lieutenant with the Simsbury Police Department?
Since July of 2018.
And how long have you served with the Simsbury Police Department?
Since November of 1994.
And prior, did you serve with any other police departments?
No, sir.
Let's begin with testimony we just heard from Detective May. Can you describe for us the conversation you had with him involving these circumstances, the first conversation you had?
Yeah, I had heard that he had spoken to Jason directly. Jason had told him that he recorded something from the chief, that the chief spoke poorly about one of the officers. So I went and asked Tim if he had heard that. And Tim explained the circumstances of how he had that conversation and how it came about it.
Okay. And did he tell you at the time that Sergeant Trombley had said that he had recorded the chief saying something about Kevin Morano?
Yes.
Was there any hesitancy or ambiguity in his statement to you at that time?
No, he says it was a longer conversation. It happened in the parking lot, but part of the conversation was that Jason had said he recorded the chief.
Now, a few minutes ago, it seemed like Detective May was having some trouble remembering the conversation. Specifically, when he spoke to you, did it appear to you that he had any difficulty regarding remembering that conversation?
No, this was probably closer to when it actually occurred.
And who did you hear from that Detective may have had a conversation with Sergeant Trombley, such that you followed up with him?
I think it was Scott Sagan.
And were you present when Detective May was interviewed as part of his internal investigation, of the internal investigation?
Yes.
And do you recall him saying again, and at that time his interview, his questioning was done under oath, correct?
Correct.
And that was true of all the witnesses for the IA, correct?
Correct.
And during that interview, do you recall him also saying again that Sergeant Trombley and he had a conversation in the parking lot where Sergeant Trombley had said he had recorded the chief making a comment about Officer Morano?
Yes.
At that point in time, did he seem to have any difficulty recalling that?
No, he wasn't as, there was definitely not as some clearness about some of the details, but he had to make sense what he said.
I mean, he testified just a few moments ago that he didn't want to get involved in this.
No,
correct?
he didn't.
So, in the line of police work, are there sometimes witnesses who are reluctant to give testimony?
I would assume so, yes.
But that's the nature of the situation, correct? Okay. Let me ask you about, you had a conversation with Gary Gray and Scott Sagan, which sort of commenced this whole situation, correct?
Correct.
Can you tell us about that conversation? How did it, who approached who, and tell us about the conversation?
Okay. So, I wouldn't have been able to recall the exact date other than you guys saying it earlier, so it was April 10th, I believe. Scott came into my office first. He closed the door and he told me that he had just gotten back from, they had just met with Ed Kaczynski, who is our union representative. And that during that meeting that Ed had with Jason and Sergeant Corcoran, Jason had said that he recorded some meetings with the chief and/or I, and that on one of the recordings, the chief spoke poorly about one of our officers. I believe they said the name. I believe they said Officer Morano. Shortly after Scott came in, Gary Gray came in right behind him. So we continued the conversation. Gary reiterated the same exact thing, that they had just met with Ed, I think at a Dunkin' Donuts or something like that locally. And Gary reiterated the same thing, that Ed had told them that Jason had recorded conversations with the chief, And in one of those conversations, he spoke poorly about one of the officers.
Did you make notes when you had the conversation with Mr. Sagan and Mr. Gray?
I did after they left because I told them, I told them I needed to inform the chief.
Thanks, yeah, that's Lieutenant Sheehan, you just testified that after you met with Mr. Sagan and Mr. Gray, you prepared some notes of the conversation.
Correct.
Are those the notes you prepared?
They are.
Are we up to Exhibit 6?
This would be 6.
I would offer that into evidence.
I have no objection given the foundation.
Did you make these notes immediately after your meeting with Mr. Sagan and Mr. Gray?
I did.
Do you recall during the conversation Tim Russell's name ever coming up?
I do not.
Do your notes reflect any mention of Mr. Russell?
They do not.
Do you recall, when you had the conversation with Mr. Sagan and Mr. Gray, did they seem surprised to you that Mr. Trombley had said that he had recorded the chief?
They did seem surprised. They seemed they seemed to take the position that it wasn't appropriate. And I even informed them. I said, I have to inform the chief of this, and the chief wasn't there that day. And they said, yeah, we know, we expect you to. And the gist of it was they couldn't believe that another officer had recorded some meetings like that.
At any point in the conversation, was there ever a discussion about the fact that if the chief made some comments about Officer Morano, that the union would grieve it, or that that was somehow a concern for them?
There was not. The only union grievance matter that was mentioned in it was that the original meeting between Ed and the two officers, or the two sergeants, was going to be about filing a grievance.
And that was about a discipline that had already been issued?
Correct. That was about something prior.
And you were present during all of the IA interviews, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to segue a little bit and just ask you, there was some testimony about an interaction that Scott Sagan had with Tim Russell. Were you here for Mr. Sagan's testimony?
Yes.
Were you the officer responsible for investigating that situation?
It was.
And generally, how did you go about investigating? I don't want to go through every detail, but can you give us a general sense of what you did as the lead investigator on that?
Sure. So based on Officer Russell's memo that he had sent me as a complaint, I spoke with Sergeant Sagan first, and he's completely accurate that when I first told him about it, it was the next day actually, he said, come to my office right now, and he already had an email written up that detailed the incident. So I asked him to send it to me, and I think I even asked him to put it in a memo form, because it was just like a Word document. I briefed the chief on it, and then interviewed people that were working that day that would have been in the area, and spoke to several people and found out that there were actually two witnesses that heard the incident inside the locker room. There was a couple other there was at least one other witness that was outside the locker room that heard a portion of it. The witnesses inside the locker room did not see any of it. It occurred in an area of the locker room that the two people weren't.
And of the two witnesses that heard, was their recollections identical, or did they differ?
They differed slightly, whereas one did not recall a weapon racking the shotgun, the less lethal shotgun, and that was the witness that was actually inside the locker room, just wasn't visually there. That was really the only difference. They both confirmed that the conversation happened, and they both considered it a supervisor doing his job and talking with a subordinate the correct behavior.
And did you, as the investigator, conclude whether there had been any untruthful statements made by anyone in that situation?
I did not find any untruthful statements.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Sure.
Lieutenant, I met you at Houston's interview. Let me ask this question. What was your role in all the interviews?
I was merely there to observe, and if the chief needed anything, I could have got it, looked something up, that was it. I didn't participate in any of the questioning. I think there was one that I clarified something.
So this piece of paper that's shown up here tonight for the first time, is that a part of this report in any way? Is it an exhibit,
I don't know what
your
report.
notes? The chief, is it a part of the,
Chief's report?
yes?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So do you know why it's not?
I don't know.
Do you know why you weren't interviewed as a witness to some of these things?
I don't know what.
Should you have been? You seem to
That's
be
not
the...
for me to decide if I'm going to be
Well,
interviewed.
let me ask it this way. You seem to be the guy that got information and sort of reported it up the chain, so to speak.
Mostly, I believe I was the guy that was given information that reported up the chain.
Right. So, but for you,
Mhm.
the chief would not know anything about any of this. You told him.
I would differ on that,
On which part?
on the part that I think it was Sergeant Sagan that said he would have told the chief, but the chief wasn't available that day, and I was the only guy here.
Okay, we're talking about two different things.
Okay.
You're talking about the Russell incident.
Nope.
No? What
I
do you
believe it was either Sergeant Sagan or Officer Gray that sat here and said the reason they told me was
Okay.
because I was the only one here, but they would have told the chief he was away.
Okay, but who told the chief?
I did.
Okay, great. So you're a witness to receiving information that formed the basis of this investigation.
I guess I'm a witness, yeah.
Why were you not interviewed?
I don't know.
Did you suggest you should be interviewed?
It's not my job to suggest who got interviewed. I wasn't the investigator.
Did you ever suggest to the chief that maybe he shouldn't conduct the investigation?
I did not.
Did you ever think maybe this should be done by an outside agency?
I did not.
Why not?
It wasn't my investigation.
Okay. And what was your working relationship with Jason over the time that you've both been here?
His supervisor as a lieutenant, and prior to that, his supervisor in the detective division.
Okay. Performance-wise, how did he do?
Good.
No problems.
No.
And yet this report, which reaches the conclusion that he took notes about the chief, you believe warrants his termination?
I didn't.
Do you think that?
I believe that if an officer lied to his superior about something of this, then I believe a termination is warranted.
What happened to Tim Russell as a result of your investigation?
That was a personnel matter, and I don't know if I'm free to say what happened.
Well, you've been talking about it,
Right.
so what happened?
We would have to refer to the chief or the town. I believe there's a personnel issue there, but,
I don't know what that means. These are all personnel issues. We're sitting here in a personnel issue.
so I don't know if I can say what specifically occurred to him. I'd have to defer to
I mean, you're
the
looking
town
for
attorney.
advice over there.
I'm looking at the town attorney.
Yeah,
because-
I think you can, was he disciplined?
No.
Okay. Then.
Okay.
So, sorry.
What's your opinion on taking personal notes about your workplace?
I don't really have an opinion.
Do you think an officer can take personal notes?
Sure.
Do you think they're personal?
Depends on what they're about, I guess.
If you go home tonight and write notes about your boss, do you think your boss has a right to get them from you?
I don't go home and write notes about anything when I go home. My notes were written here, so.
Right, but if you had, you believe it was a lawful order, tasked Jason to turn over his personal notes.
I believe it was a lawful order based on Jason using them as a defense in his idea of what a recording is.
Did you know at the time that they were asked for, that Jason had a grievance pending about his interactions with the chief?
I know there's a grievance pending. I don't know the timeline on exactly when everything was asked, but picked up on some of it.
And what's the basis of the grievance? Do you know much? Were you there? Were you part of it?
I was part
What's your
of
job?
it.
I'm sorry, what's your job here?
Lieutenant here.
Doing what?
I'm in charge of patrol.
Okay, got it. So that would put you directly in kind of the supervisor to a sergeant who's working in patrol's capacity.
Correct.
Okay. So the issues over Jason's performance, were they brought to your attention by the chief?
Which part? What are you talking about?
When he was when you met with him and Sergeant Corcoran and told them about deficiencies that were perceived by the administration.
Okay. So what's the
Were
question?
you involved in that?
I was.
And what was your role?
I'm the one who discovered it.
Okay. And so you reported it to the chief,
Correct.
and the chief met with the two sergeants.
Correct.
Were you there?
I was.
Were the two sergeants told that there would be no discipline issued?
I don't recall that.
Is that part of what the grievance is about?
I don't know. I've never physically seen the grievance, I don't think.
Well, what did your notes mean where you wrote Trombley filing grievance, parentheses, double jeopardy, question mark?
That's what Gary and Scott told me they were going to file an agreement on, and I didn't really understand.
What does that mean?
I don't know, that's why there's a question mark.
Okay.
I didn't understand.
Does that mean the chief had already met with them and disciplined them, and so disciplining them again?
I don't know.
Okay, you don't know.
I put a question mark, I don't know.
Right, but you don't know what double jeopardy means?
I know what double jeopardy means, but I
What's
don't
it
know what
mean?
it means in
All right,
regards
well, let's
to
start with what it
grievance.
means. Let's just go back to the original learnings. What's it mean?
In regards to a criminal matter, it means to be held accountable for something twice,
Okay,
generally.
all right. And so, do you understand from the grievance that that's what the grievance is about in part?
I understand because you're telling me that, yes.
You're learning for the very first time sitting here tonight.
No, I've heard it, I've never physically
You
read
just
the
said you're
entire
learning
grievance.
from me.
Yeah,
That's
I'm
not
learning
true,
the
is it?
details from
I'm
you.
going to object again, you're not letting him answer.
I'm learning the details from you.
Okay, got it. Have you issued any directives about people keeping notes?
Me?
Yeah.
No, sir.
I have nothing further, Lieutenant. Thank you.
Okay.
Nothing further, thank you.
Any of you guys have any questions for Chief?
Nope.
Okay, thank you.
Other than submitting the tape of Detective May's interview, I have nothing further.
Counselor, you have any witnesses?
I do, but I would first suggest that the town hasn't met its burden. The town has not met its burden to show that termination is warranted. The town has not met its burden to show that there's been any due process, there's been no just cause, there's been no progressive discipline. And I would say, that you actually don't need any evidence from us. There's no basis to terminate my client. The evidence falls far short from anything that would warrant a termination. All we've heard about is that the chief believed that he'd been recorded in some way, and he vigorously sought to get those personal notes. And he used his authority and his position to write what he calls lawful orders to turn over a journal, a diary. Any of us could go home and take notes. That doesn't mean your employer's entitled to them. So I don't believe there's been any evidence produced tonight that's any different from this report that has inaccuracies, misstatements, untruthful statements in it by itself that would warrant the four of you reaching a determination that my client should be terminated. So I do have witnesses, but I would first ask the board to consider whether or not it believes the town has met its burden, because I don't have the burden, they have the burden to establish that the termination is
We're
warranted.
looking for a directed verdict.
You're probably not going to get it, but yes.
May I respond?
What?
Sure.
He just disagrees.
But let him speak for himself.
Yeah, I will.
I do disagree. Yes, it is the town's burden to show just cause, and I think what you've heard from these witnesses and in the exhibits that were presented, that there were lies. What we've heard from the defense is they don't want you to look at the lie. They want to ask, well, focus on the request for the notes. Was that proper or not? Our position is that there would not have been a request if Mr. Trombley did not specifically mention them in his email response to the chief, which he was asserting as his defense. When the chief asked him the question, did you record me? Didn't ask, did you audibly record me? Just, did you record me? His answer was no. And then a few hours later, he comes up with, this theory of, I have recordings, but it's notes. But I would say more directly to the lies that are the key issue. There were testimony about each of the three lies, and I'll just remind you that it was, he denied telling the chief that he had made a recording of the chief making a comment about Morano. We have testimony from Ed Kaczynski saying that, in fact, that's what Sergeant Trombley told him. So, to the extent Sergeant Trombley denied that, that was a lie. There was testimony from the chief that One of the things Sergeant Trombley said was the only reason he did record was people told me to record. There is no evidence of anyone giving that advice. We can't prove a negative. And unless they're going to present a witness to say that they actually advised Sergeant Trombley to make these recordings, that's the second lie. And the third lie you've heard in direct testimony from the chief, that when he first asked that very simple question, did you record me? His answer was no. Subsequently, he said actually it was yes. So he either lied the first time he answered the question, or he lied the second time. And that's, we believe, fully meets our burden, but certainly the, Mr. Trombley has an opportunity to present evidence. But any request for a directed verdict or anything of that sort, I think should be denied because the evidence does meet our burden. Thank you.
I'm going to deny it because I'd like to hear more.
Okay, our first witness is Sergeant Corcoran.
Sergeant Corcoran, do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as may be the case, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, shall help you God or upon penalty of perjury? Edit. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Your role here at Simsbury Police is you're a police sergeant?
Correct.
And did you, at the time this all was happening, work the midnight shift?
Correct.
Are you under subpoena?
No.
And was there a time that you and Sergeant Trombley were spoken to by the chief about
Yes.
what?
Deficiencies on the shift.
And give us a little more detail. I mean, you don't have to go into everything, but who was there, what happened, approximately when was it?
I think Sergeant Trombley and I were called into the chief's office after a staff meeting. Chief was there, Lieutenant Sheen was there. We were notified that they were conducting a 30-day review on our shift. They were going through some of the cases. They were listening to audio recordings of us using the radio. They were also doing surveillance of us and where the cruisers are positioned. Unbeknownst to us, this whole investigation, it came to light there was some deficiencies discovered during that time. One of my questions was, are other shifts being looked at for the same thing? The response was no. We work during the day and we know what goes on. So I was a little bit shocked by, obviously it was an intensive investigation, we were unaware of it.
It's kind of like a secret investigation into your actions. How long you worked here?
15 and a half years.
You ever heard of anything like that before?
No, not without a complaint or some other extenuating circumstances.
In this meeting with the chief, was there a discussion about whether you were going to be disciplined?
Yeah, and I think he said this would not lead to discipline. He wanted to know more information. He wanted to know, there was a couple particular incidents he had questions about. We weren't given a date, even the officer who was involved, so we really didn't have any information to justify a response to him. We had to go back and do the research ourselves to find out exactly what he was talking about.
Despite what happened that day, were you disciplined?
Yes.
And tell us about what happened. What were you disciplined?
I think it was 2.5 or 3 weeks later, we were called in. We were both given written warning for the charges of insubordination, incompetence, and I think neglect of duty.
This seems like an easy question, but do you agree with what the chief had
No.
found?
No.
Why did you not agree?
A lot of those things in there, one of them in particular, there was an incident where an officer allegedly did not respond to a call. I wasn't working that day, I wasn't the supervisor. However, that was in my write-up. Some of the other things could be explained, but at that point, it was beyond explaining to the chief, and he had already made his decision.
Did you file a grievance?
Yes.
Did all of this happen, to the best of your knowledge, before any of this stuff about recording and things that happened with Jason?
Yes.
And what's your understanding or testimony about the whole topic of recordings made by Jason?
As far as I know, it's not illegal as long as one party is aware of the recording. I'm not aware of any policy with the police department, with the town about recording anyone else. And I guess, and I had mentioned it to the chief too, that I really don't understand why this investigation even kicked off if what was being looked into, Jason possibly having a recording, again, is not against the law or the policy.
Were you interviewed once or more than once about all this?
I believe twice.
The chief wrote that you were defensive during our conversation. I believe you were defensive?
I don't believe so. I think he's interpreting defensive as my disagreement with things, but I've always been respectful to him.
You had to provide you also provided like a written response that the chief has in his report here? You sent him an email about this?
Yes, I was ordered to respond to him through email, and that was before there was an IA.
What do you, were you entitled to confer with your union about responding to this?
No, the chief came in, I think it was a weekend shift, 12:30 at night, questioned me about it in his office, and I was to immediately respond to him.
Did that seem unusual?
It did.
Why?
It's outside of his working hours. It was a weekend, 12:30 at night. It was strange because he's not normally here at that hour.
How about the respond immediately to me in writing?
That was strange too because I had had the conversation with him face to face, so I didn't really know why he needed it in writing.
Do you have any other testimony relative to the topic of recording or this investigation? I have nothing further, thank you.
Just a couple questions. So you mentioned, Sergeant, that you've been a police officer for 15 and a half years, correct?
Correct.
And do you believe that if a supervisor asks you a question, you're supposed to answer that question honestly?
Correct.
Now, as an officer, you could choose not to answer, correct?
It depends on what it's pertaining to. I think there's some instances where they should be required to answer.
Okay. But if you provide an answer, you're expected to give an honest answer, correct?
If it's work related, certainly.
Okay. And you, it's your testimony, I guess, that you've never heard Jason Trombley make any statements about ever recording the police chief, is that correct?
No, we had discussed it, so I have heard him talk about it. But he didn't make the disclosure to me until this came to light and the chief called him and questioned him about it.
So you only heard about that after inquiry had begun?
Correct.
Did you hear about it during the Krasinski conversation?
I did not. I was at that meeting. I showed up a little bit after that they were already there. And I did relieve myself to use the bathroom. I do not recall hearing about that.
So, I think Attorney Ment was asking you about this email that you had sent the chief where you put that you were called into his office and told that there was a rumor about there being recording. You had never heard any rumors about Mr. Trombley saying he had made recordings of the chief or other administrators?
When the chief questioned me about the recording, I took the chief to mean audio recording, and I clarified through him that I know if he's referring to recording as audio, I know Jason to be taking notes and recording that way.
Did you know that at the time you were first questioned about this? That there was an issue in play about whether he was taking notes or whether he was making audio recordings?
Yes.
So the very first time in May, you had known that Jason took written notes or claimed to take written notes as opposed to audio recordings?
The first time I became aware of the issue of recording to mean audio was when the chief had called Jason the first time. Since then, Jason had notified me of what was going on. After that date, the chief came in and questioned me about it.
So the first, but going back just to be clear, the first time you had any discussion about Mr. Trombley recording the chief in any way was after Mr. Trombley had been questioned by the chief.
Right, recording to mean audio. I know that he had taken notes.
No other questions, thank you.
Hey, you guys have any questions?
Thank you.
Is that it? Anybody else?
Yeah, still going. What's our quitting time, by the way?
We got a little time.
Okay, so Jason's my next witness.
Jason, start. You solemnly swear, or solemnly or sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, shall help you God or upon penalty of perjury.
I do.
You.
Okay. Let's just go over some biographical information. Just tell us about yourself.
So my name is Jason Trombley. I started here in 2008 as an officer. Worked in the detective division for about 3.5, 4 years maybe, and was promoted to sergeant with Scott Sagan at the same time in August of 2018. And have been, when I first got promoted to sergeant, I went to the midnight shift, and then just recently through bid, went to A squad day shift.
The reason this hearing is taking place now, not a couple of weeks ago, is because the commissioners allowed you to have an extension because you just had a child born.
Yeah, I had a really joyful moment. Second baby was born, really healthy on October 1st.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for letting the hearing go past the normal time. It's hard to know where to start, but let's start with you becoming a sergeant and working midnights. Let's sort of get into that frame of reference. You've heard from Sergeant Corcoran, you've heard from the chief, you've heard from Lieutenant Sheehan that they found deficiencies with the midnight shift. And they found as supervisors, you partly responsible, I guess. Is that a fair?
Correct.
Okay. What, give us the backdrop for what was happening and how you found out and what happened. Sort of walk us through that.
So when I first started here, I worked the midnight shift. I was a junior guy for many years, and I bumped around. And midnight shift kind of always ran itself. It was, I wouldn't say a relaxed environment, but you would come in on midnights, the shift change would happen, and it was common practice for the shift to have roll call, and then after roll call, you would have like a coffee or meal break right then and there. Guys would then transfer into doing, reports and different things, unless a call came in, of course, and you'd hit the road right away. And there was never this sense of urgency. So when I was promoted, Sergeant Sewell ran the ship for umpteen years here. He left, and the Sergeant Corcoran kind of took the role from him. And then there was, I think Sergeant Chase got promoted. He worked the midnight shift for a little while. And then he, through seniority, was able to get bumped off. Then I came on, and under Sergeant Corcoran, we worked together, and I just kind of filled the role of how the midnight shift has been run for as far as I've known it, and just kind of keeping things status quo and taking our calls for service and just focusing on doing a good job and serving the community.
Were you surprised by the chief's investigation into the midnight shift?
Yes, yeah, that took me by surprise when we first got called in about it.
What was surprising?
That there was some sort of a secretive investigation that took place without us knowing, that they were looking at, I believe it was the video surveillance, car cameras, just things of that nature, and that we had no idea that, one, that there was even an issue, and two, that they were looking into it.
talk to us about what was the meeting like when you were called into the chief to talk about this?
So I believe that was after a staff meeting, when Chief Bolter took over. He started these staff meetings where all the sergeants would get together and a roundtable discussion about just the good things, the bad, and kind of updates on what's going on with the shift. Well, following one of those meetings, I believe it was March 14th, the chief called in myself and Sergeant Corcoran, and Lieutenant Sheehan was there. And that's when we were told that there was deficiencies on the shift and that people weren't going to calls, there was an unanswered call for service, and people were not like hitting the road. They were spending way too much time in the PD. And then I remember distinctly something coming out about people weren't doing their cruiser checks, people weren't submitting the cruiser logs, and that roll call wasn't happening in the proper room. So myself and Sergeant Corcoran tried to start to work through each of these things, and of course we defended, well, no, roll call is happening in the correct room. As far as we know it, guys were hitting the road, minus what I just talked about the roll call and the meal break as what was common practice to us. But that was new information. And then the unanswered call for service and any other deficiency we had no idea about. And I remember Sergeant Corcoran and I looking at each other like, what are we talking about? I know Lieutenant Sheehan grabbed the computer and it was kind of like dates and a name came up, but we still had no idea about what was even going on. But I remember at the onset, Chief Bolter saying this is not disciplinary in nature, you're not being disciplined, but I want to know what's going on here. Tell us, I need some more information on this. But we had really no idea what we were even talking about, other than the simple thing about having roll call in the right room. So following that meeting, I know Sergeant Corcoran and I, we put our heads together, tried figuring out what we were talking about, and I know, so that meeting was sometime in the afternoon, maybe 3-4 p.m. I was due back that night at 11 p.m. So before the conclusion of that meeting, I said, well, I'm back tonight, do you want me to address this? And of course, these are major things, I want to address it immediately. So I came in that night on the midnight shift, shut the door with the guys on the midnight shift, and addressed the topics. And then I followed up with an email to the entire shift about the roll call reminders and updates and what we're going to do.
Were you disciplined
Yes.
ultimately for this?
About 3 weeks later.
Did that surprise you?
Yeah. We were given a written warning for the same exact things. And the chief said, well, and then in that time frame, I was so confused because I said, well, chief, everything that you talked about, I addressed immediately that night. And you even agreed, and same with Lieutenant Sheehan, that there have been significant improvements in these last 3 weeks. Everything you've wanted, we've changed and we're working on and we're doing. And he even agreed. He said, yeah, I understand that. And everything we're seeing is going well, but you're not getting disciplined for the last few weeks. You were getting disciplined for prior to our first meeting, prior to that March 14th meeting.
Did that make any sense to you?
No.
Because why?
Well, because when we were first called in, we were told we're not being disciplined, so we spoke openly about it. I felt as though, well, if he's telling me it's not going to lead to discipline, well, then I don't need a union rep there. I don't need any sort of protection in regards to being disciplined. And then to know that his orders that he gave us and those deficiencies that he told us about that we had no idea. Like I said, Chief, I didn't even know about these things. You're bringing this to my attention. Well, let's address it. And we did. And I remember some of the other issues between Sergeant Corcoran and I. We addressed the issues and we thought they were resolved. From that point on, it was clear and apparent that when you come into work, the chief doesn't want that coffee meal break at the beginning of the shift anymore. He wants everybody in a cruiser, do your cruiser check, give us the log, and hit the road. Yes, sir. And everybody on the midnight shift started immediately, and it was progressing and going that way every single night.
Sergeant Corcoran told us what the sustained charges were. Insubordination?
That was one of them.
What was insubordinate?
I believe the insubordination charge was failure to collect a cruiser log at the beginning of the shift. And I found that odd because for the length of time that I've been here, we've always submitted a cruiser log. That cruiser log has the beginning mileage, your ending mileage, and it's a brief check of the cruiser. So it was always turned in at the end of the shift because you needed your ending mileage. Now, that topic came up recently at one of the staff meetings by a sergeant on another shift, saying that, hey, with my shift, I'm going to try having the guys go out and do the cruiser checks right away and come in and hand it to me, and then at the end of the shift, they're going to come back in and finish it. And so there was no direct order that was ever given to us that that is the way it must be done. And from what Sergeant Corcoran and I both remember, because we would communicate on these things, was that, hey, was that a direct order for us? No, like we were constantly told, you handle your shift as you see fit. As long as you're getting the form done and it's turned in, that's all we care about. And we were doing that. And I know when I was the supervisor on the shift, I made sure every day that I got the cruiser logs from the people that were working.
The grievance that's pending is in what stage, what process?
So I was put on admin leave on September 9th. Days after that, we had a mediation hearing where 2 state mediators came in. And during that hearing, there was basically concerns about this double jeopardy that was already mentioned, and the concerns of basically an MPP that was going to be filed. So we're forwarding it on. It's going to arbitration, and I'm not sure at what stages, but I know that we've already filed for arbitration, and there's a date set. I believe it was going to be October 2nd, which was the day after my baby was born, and I was still going to make myself available. And for some reason, the date got pushed back a month later. So I think in November is our arbitration hearing on it.
Okay. You've read this report probably more times than anybody in this room, right?
Yes, sir.
This report concludes that you're a liar, that you're a malicious gossiper, that you're insubordinate, that you are guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer. Tell us what you thought when you read through this.
I was hurt. I was hurt by it a lot. I was surprised. The day that the chief called me in, it was a little odd. I was a supervisor working day shift, and it wasn't until the end of the shift, so I had worked the whole shift on September 9th, and Lieutenant Sheehan saw me in the hallway and said, hey Jay, real quick, on your way out, before you leave, stop in and see me. I got to tell you something. Okay, so I get changed. I walk in his office and he goes, oh, no, real quick, the chief wants to see you. So the chief is sitting at his desk with Lieutenant Sifo, and he goes, here's the letter, you're being put on paid admin leave, and there's, I'm recommending termination. And the packet was, or the whole IA was in the packet. And so I said, okay, and I left and I read it when I got home. But yeah, just surprised. I don't think there's any merit to this.
Why?
Because I didn't do any of those things that he's alleging that I did. There's a big play on words with the word record and everything. I've been nothing but truthful and forthcoming and did my best to explain all these things that I was questioned along the way. And I feel as though that all the points that you've already hit on in terms of this investigation was handled by the person who had a vested interest in it, almost to control the outcome of the actual complaint. And being that there was a rumor, I mean, this whole thing started over a rumor. And there's a ton of rumors in this building. I have no knowledge of any other rumor ever being investigated in this building.
Do you have any prior discipline here of any significance?
The only one that comes to mind is the written warning that we just discussed that we're currently going to arbitration over.
You kept written notes, recordings?
Correct.
Why?
To document all these things that have been happening. It seemed as though after the first grievance that I filed, it was regarding, I'm a negotiator on the assigned to the SWAT team, and there was a staff meeting one afternoon, and during that staff meeting, Lieutenant Sheehan's, the commander of the team, said, oh, there's going to be a call out tonight, just be ready for it. I asked, are negotiators going to be needed? Yes. Okay, so I leave the meeting here, and of course, shortly thereafter, after leaving here, then I got the Everbridge notification of the call out. Long story short, I would say I'm responding. They cancel me later. And of course I file, put in an overtime card for a 4-hour minimum for the call out. It was denied, grievance happened, the chief resolved it at his level and ultimately paid me for the grievance to resolve it, the 4-hour minimum. And then after that, it just seemed like everything was unfolding. I remember taking a sick day one Saturday. I believe it was my first sick day in maybe 1.5 to 2 years. I don't know the exact dates of my last sick day, but it was very uncommon for me to take a sick day. And when I called in, Sergeant Samselsky answered the phone, and he was somewhat upset, like, "Jay, why are you sick?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not feeling good." "Oh, everyone doesn't feel good." And somewhat like hung up the phone on me, was really short with me. Later I found out that the Christmas party for the union was the following day, and he was then ordered to work not only the evening shift, but the midnight shift, and it affected his plans for the following day. Yeah, I was saddened by that, but of course I was ill and I wasn't suitable to come to work. The reason I tell you that story is because weeks later, this came from Officer Gray, was that, so this came from the chief to Officer Gray, that I lied about, that he thought that there's a rumor that I lied about this sick day, and that the chief was going to look into my one sick day. And if he looked into it, the chief, he was worried that if I lied and then Scott lied, that there would have been this thing. And I'm sorry, I'm going off track here. The rumor was that I took a sick day to go to a party at Sergeant Sagan's house, which was the farthest thing from the truth. There was no connection to that at all. But it was just odd to me that I was being questioned about one sick day, and that there was this rumor. And then there was, following that, there was an incident at the airport where a few of us were going on a union conference trip to a labor conference, and during that an officer was arrested for a felony at the airport, and that then there was a rumor that I interfered with the arrest of this officer, which was the farthest thing from the truth, but the chief was looking into that one as well, although the colonel from the state police said that we did not interfere at any manner, that we were respectful, that we asked questions, but that was it. So then all these different incidences started happening after the grievance, so yes, I did take notes to document all these different conversations, and I remember having many different meetings with the chief.
So you haven't been taking notes your entire career here about things.
No.
You felt a reason to start taking notes,
Yes.
and you just explained why.
Yes.
How did you take the notes?
So sometimes I would handwrite them, and then other times I would do them on my computer at home.
As far as you know, is that allowed?
Yes.
Did you do that thinking they were your notes?
Yes.
Did you do that thinking that the employer doesn't have a right to your notes?
Yes, I thought they were my personal private notes and not connected to anything at work.
Did you write things in there that you wouldn't want the chief to see?
Yes.
Like what?
It was basically my perception and all the conversations and all the different events leading up to everything I just discussed, and some more that I can't think of right now. And with the ongoing grievance, I felt as though he was trying to obtain information that would help his side of the story.
You called me at some point to talk about this, right?
Yes.
And did I tell you that I didn't think you should turn over your personal notes?
Yes.
Did I tell you that I communicated with the town's lawyer about that?
Yes.
And what worried you about giving the chief your personal notes?
That essentially he had, a full document of all my, it was my personal diary, and he was able to read anything that I wrote, whether for or against him or anything that was related to this department from my view at the time.
Did you think that could, in and of itself, create some problems for you?
Yes.
How so?
Well, just that if it wasn't something that the chief agreed with, that he would think down upon me or think differently of me.
Did the chief ever tell you, when he asked for your notes, that he wasn't going to read them?
No.
So when he sat here earlier tonight, it seems like hours ago, did he tell you that he just wanted the metadata, he wasn't going to read anything?
No, the first time the word metadata came up was way after that through an email chain, and I believe you were the one that notified me, and I had no idea what metadata even was. I had to look it up.
Right. And we asked that question, right? We said to the attorney and the chief, these are Jason's personal notes. How can we meet your needs without just trampling over your rights? Did we come to a solution?
We did. And that solution was giving him just the meeting notes that he wanted. It was confined to the meetings with him, that I believe. That was to the best of my recollection. But I know it was a redacted version. It wasn't my whole original file.
And did you mislead them to think that that was the original complete document?
No.
On the other hand, did you, through me, report that we were giving them a document that contained your notes, but you had redacted personal things?
Yes.
Did the chief then ever say to you, don't worry, I'm not going to read it, Jason?
No.
He wasn't satisfied,
Obviously not.
and he interviewed you, and at some point you learned that this is now an internal affairs investigation, late in June.
Yes.
Did it seem like you were kind of already subjected to this internal affairs investigation before then?
Yeah, it felt as though this had been going on for months. From the original conversations when he first asked me about it, 2 months later, it was the end of June when I was actually served with the letter that said I was the subject of an IA.
Did that seem strange to you or unusual, the delay and all that happened before he announced there's an internal affairs investigation?
Yeah, because not that I've had to read our internal affairs policy that closely before, but once I got that, I read it and saw that, you know, most IAs take less than 30 days and that you're going to be notified within a certain time limit if you are the subject of an IA. And it just felt as though the investigation had already commenced prior to me even receiving notification that there was an official IA. Hold on.
You believe you're entitled to certain rights if you're the subject of an internal affairs investigation?
Yes.
Do you believe that you were not afforded those?
Yes.
Do you believe that you were not afforded any due process in this investigation?
Yes.
Do you believe that the chief was in fact the complainant, the victim, the one who was offended?
Yes.
Was he the one who conducted the interview?
Yes.
Did he argue with you at times over what he said versus you said when you were trying to answer his questions?
Yes.
In essence, becoming a witness to a conversation that he's asking you about.
Yes.
Sort of saying that he didn't remember the conversation that way, right?
Yes.
And that's in the transcript, right? Where
Yes.
we sort of have that exchange. At the internal affairs interview, where we sat and you answered his questions, did you say to the chief, I didn't give you the complete document, and here's why I did it?
Yes, I felt as though we explained it.
Did he order you after that to give him the complete document?
Yes.
Did you do that?
Yes.
What was his response then to you?
So he gave me a timeline not a timeline, he gave me a deadline of, it was a second order, the same thing all over again that he wants my file. It was prior to another staff meeting that we had. I believe the date was August 13th, if I'm not mistaken. And I walked into his office with the document on the flash drive, and I handed it to him, and he asked me, kind of smirked and said, "What is this?" And I said, "This is what you ordered me to do, ordered to give you." And he said, "Well, you didn't do it the first time, so how do I know this is what you're giving me this time?" And I said, "Well, this is what you asked of me, I'm giving it to you." And somehow something about metadata came up, and like I said, I'm not an expert on metadata. And he asked me about like what the metadata was going to say, So I remember telling him, well, I did check it, somehow just through a brief info on the file, and that the original date on the file would have been, to the best of my recollection, December of 2018, which was when kind of all of these things started happening. And I said, but the last modified date would have been either this morning or yesterday, and so he asked me, well, why? Well, why would it say that, and why would the date be so soon? So I told him, well, if I'm going to give you about 10 pages of my personal diary, of course I'm going to proofread it and check it for spelling errors and grammar before giving it to you. So then he went on to tell me that that's not what he was looking for, and this provides no value, and that asked me, like, how is this going to help anything? And I don't know. You're the one that requested it. So I'm just complying with your order, and that I've tried to comply with all of your orders through this whole process, and basically told him that I hope this investigation gets concluded quickly, that I've got nothing to lie and nothing to hide, and I just asked for a thorough, complete investigation. That was pretty much the end of the conversation.
Okay, so it wasn't good enough.
No.
The implication of that exchange between you and him, if you understood it the way he was sort of saying it, the implication was that you created the document the day before. That the document wasn't, the original date now was, I mean, did you also give this to some forensic person who could figure this out, some computer expert to get the original date?
No, and I'm not sure why it didn't suffice or wasn't enough for what he was looking for. It did have an original date, and the document was labeled timeline, which is what I originally named it, of all these timeline of events. And I even offered to him to open the file before, he said, I don't care about what the file says.
Well, he told us that at the interview.
Yeah, at the interview. And then kind of jokingly said, well, I would have to open it to make sure it's not an invitation to a barbecue or something of that nature. But at this exchange, when I gave him the full file, I said, you know what, Chief, if you want to read it. I said, there's so much information in here that there's no way that I could have just sat down at my computer and just started writing and created this document last night or this morning as this last modified date.
And so, if the chief had asked you if you just created this document within a day or two before handing it to him, what would your answer have been?
Absolutely not.
That it was created?
It was created whatever the original start date on the file was, which I believe was around December of 2018.
So these notes were made relatively contemporaneously, would be the word I'd select, to say kind of around the time it was happening, the notes were happening.
Yes.
You weren't months later writing about something that happened months earlier.
No, it was one file that I continued to just update with every time something would happen or we would have a meeting about different things. I would then be able to jot down the meeting, the date, who was there, what we talked about, and just to keep track because there's so many of these things. And then we were being hit with deficiencies on the shift. So then my main goal was to make sure that we're addressing these concerns and we're doing everything we should be. So yeah.
Was there information in your notes that you ultimately gave to the chief that you think will help you in the grievance?
Yes.
So have you, in essence, now turned over all of that?
Yes.
Do you think that's fair?
No.
Why not?
Well, it feels like my privacy was violated. I still feel as though, whether or not I work in a police department or not, that my personal private notes that I did at home are not the right to my employer. Whether or not it's the chief of police or not, I stood up to him and I said no. And I ultimately gave them to him, and it still wasn't good enough.
So the chief writes, I'm going to give you, where's your copy of this report? Is it right here?
Yes.
So that's the chief's report of September 9th.
Okay.
right?
Yes, yeah, mine doesn't have page numbers on it for some reason. This is the one that the chief provided me.
I have another copy. Hold on, let's-
So that's Exhibit 4?
It is, yes, so he's looking at Exhibit 4. We're gonna, for the moment, go to page 15. And we're gonna go through this. The first statement says Sergeant Jason Trombley has been a police officer since July 3, 2008. He was promoted to sergeant on August 20, 2018. Is that true?
Yes,
The next one says you were issued a written warning on April 2nd for neglect of duty, insubordination, and incompetence. Is that true?
yes.
What was the incompetence?
To the best of my record.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.